Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. This is our June 11th, 2021 legislative update. Congress has completed its Memorial Day break and has returned to Washington. Traditionally, May, June are among the more intense legislative months. And this year has not proved to be an exception. Lots of things happening in Congress, lots of things happening in Washington, D.C. And so we will get right into it. Start off with a little bit of history. Today is the 3,205th anniversary of the fall of Troy. I don't know if that's relevant, but I thought it was interesting, so I thought I'd bring it up. Perhaps more relevant, today is the anniversary of the creation of the committee that from the Second Continental Congress that drafted the Declaration of Independence. The committee made up of John Adams, Robert Livingston, Ben Franklin, Roger Sherman, and of course, Thomas Jefferson. Of the five, Thomas Jefferson was both the youngest and at the time, the least accomplished. So you can kind of think of him as the intern of the Continental Congress. And like most interns, he was given all of the work to do. Ben Franklin and John Adams, understanding how committees work, knew that if the five people tried to work together to write the Declaration, it would never happen. And so they just gave all the work to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson reasonably quickly produced a draft of the Declaration. Adams, Franklin, Sherman, and Livingston, to a lesser extent, edited it and perfected it. And the result of this intern's work is perhaps the greatest single expression of individual liberty ever articulated. And it was on today in 1775 when Thomas Jefferson got the assignment. Big news from Washington so far from last week is that the Senate passed the Endless Frontier Act. Interesting note on the name. As we talked about last time, it's not technically the Endless Frontier Act anymore. It's the U.S. Innovation and Competitiveness Act, or Competition Act, excuse me, but nobody calls it that because it's hard to say, and Endless Frontier Act is more poetic. So everybody in Washington is still referring to it as the Endless Frontier Act, even though it technically isn't. But it is now passed the Senate. The vote was 68 to 32. Republicans voted against the bill. A majority of Republicans voted against it, although enough did vote for it that it was able to overcome a filibuster, requiring 60 votes to do that. The Democratic vote was 49-1, with Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont being the one exception. The total size of the bill, and remember the bill started out as a $100 billion bill. The final version of it in the Senate is $250 billion, so it grew a little bit in there. The spending priorities didn't change much from our last update. Just to run down them very quickly, semiconductor program, that's the CHIPS Act, got about $52 billion, more or less equal to what the NSF, National Science Foundation, got for general programming. The new Technology Innovation Directorate at the NSF ends up with $29 billion. Most of which will go into tech transfer programs, which is exciting, about $4.3 billion of which is for research. DARPA, which was a late entry into the bill, will get $18 billion in new dollars. DOE's research wing will get $17 billion. And then NASA will get $10 billion. More on that in just a second. As you can see, the priorities of the bill shifted, and some of this is a little disappointing, but overall it's a great bill. That will invest a lot of needed money into research and engineering programs. The issue is that the Senate added a ton of additional provisions to the bill, increasing the size of the bill from about 250 pages to 1,500 pages. Among these are new rules for research security, particularly academic researchers that accept federal research funds will have to comply with some new rules to make sure that their research findings don't escape. There's a slew of provisions in the bill targeting China, some of which are indirectly targeting China, some of which are directly aimed at China. There is, for example, a provision in the final bill that prohibits the U.S. federal government from spending any money on the Beijing Olympics in 2022 and calls for the U.S. to boycott those Olympics. Now, I don't think that is binding. I think ultimately that's the president's call, but it expresses the sense of the Senate, at least, that the United States should boycott those Olympics. There are some nice programs in here for K through 12 STEM education, particularly computer education. And getting back to NASA, a big chunk of the addition that has been added to the bill is the NASA reauthorization bill. This had to be done this year anyway, so this is just a convenient way to get it taken care of. But there are some pretty substantial space policy provisions in the bill dictating how the U.S. will do space over the next 5 years. Most importantly, from our perspective, is some good language supporting commercial spaceflight and taking some steps to encourage commercial private companies that are going into space. Then there's a bunch of smaller things, including new rules on merger fees. These are the fees companies have to pay the government when they merge, just their paperwork fees. But this will increase the amount that it costs to merge two companies. That's going to come up in a second, because we have some problems on the horizon. Remember earlier this year, the Endless Frontier Act was the one must-pass bill that Congress was considering. And as I pointed out, it's not actually a must-pass bill. If it fails to pass, that would be a lost opportunity, but it's not as though anything, existing programs would collapse if Congress can't pass it. So the first red flag we saw was in the vote tally. As I mentioned, the majority of Republicans in the Senate voted against the bill. That weakens the claim that this is bipartisan. It is, of course, a bipartisan bill. It does have support from both parties, just far less than we had anticipated in the Republicans. And their primary objection is just the size of the bill. It's just very expensive, and they object to the additional government spending. But the House has now come out and said they have objections as well. Nancy Pelosi has indicated some concerns. In particular, House members have pointed out that the Endless Frontier Act includes revenue-generating provisions, including the merger provision I mentioned a minute ago. The problem with that is that under the Constitution, all revenue-generating bills have to start in the House. Those provisions didn't. They appeared for the first time in the Senate. Now, Senate leaders will claim that the bill itself started in the House because there is a House version of the Endless Frontier Act. Therefore, they're covered. I'm not a constitutional scholar. I don't understand this particular provision of the Constitution well enough to know who's right, but I do know that it is a serious constitutional concern. And if the House is asserting that the Senate has violated the Constitution, as some House staff are now doing, that represents a fairly big obstacle to final passage. As I mentioned, the price tag is turning off conservatives and Republicans in both the Senate and the House, which will make it more difficult to move. And the House leadership has now come out and said they are in favor of a different approach to doing research, which is just to pass a very large NSF reauthorization bill that just raises the amount we're spending on all research, which is, of course, a good thing, but it would represent a fairly unfortunate missed opportunity for Congress to make some real changes in the research infrastructure of this country to make our federally funded research more effective. So what happens next? Well, the next thing that has to happen is the House has to pass something. They are working on the NSF Reauthorization Act and a couple other bills that could become the House alternative to the Endless Frontier Act. None of those bills are a sure thing. There's still a lot of fighting and bipartisan bickering about those bills, so it is not 100% sure that they'll be able to pass them. But in general, it is easier for the House to pass bills than the Senate because there's no filibuster rule. So they will probably pass something. Once that happens, the Endless Frontier Act in the Senate and whatever the House passes would have to be reconciled. The two bills would have to be combined. A conference committee would then have to decide all of the difference in the bills before they go back to the House and Senate for an additional vote. The problem is, if the House asserts that the Endless Frontier Act is, by definition, unconstitutional, there can't be a conference committee. that, or at least the House could assert that there can't be a conference committee because you can't conference an unconstitutional bill. There's probably some gray area in there, but that's obviously a concern. And if the House wants to assert that its approach to research funding is better than the Senate's approach, they can assert the constitutional claim as a way of undermining the Senate's ability to move its own legislation. The result of that would unfortunately mean that the Senate would have to go back to work and pass an additional bill based on whatever the House passes, or at least whatever has been introduced in the House, which can certainly happen, but that would take more time. Additionally, and the problem with that is that Senate Democrats made a large number of concessions to Senate Republicans to maintain their support. The CHIPS Act was one of the big ones. Senator Cornyn was the primary champion of that bill, a Republican from Texas. If negotiation starts with the House bill that will probably not contain any of those provisions, that could make it harder for Senate Democrats to get Republican support. Now, the filibuster, depending on how this moves, might be off the table because the Senate has already passed the bill. Bills coming out of conference committee can't be filibustered. But it does make things much, much more complicated than they were not that very long ago. So what we have here is a bill that was absolutely certain to pass is now merely likely to pass. And we're not nearly as sure what the final form of that bill is going to look like. IEEE-USA continues to push House and Senate leaders to support at least the basic structure of the Senate bill. Specifically, we want the Tech Directorate in the NSF to focus on high priority and most promising avenues of research. That is, the types of research that are most likely to have an impact on American society. We want there to be a focus on technology transfer, which is arguably the weakest part of the research infrastructure. And we love the fact that the Endless Frontier Act pulls innovation out of kind of the tech hubs, Silicon Valley, Boston, Austin, Seattle, a few other places, into the rest of the country, and deepens the STEM workforce by training workers at all levels to enter this field. We think, regardless of a lot of the other things in there, those are crucial elements of whatever the final deal should be. A little bit of an update on cybersecurity. As I've mentioned in these updates before, everybody in Washington knows we need to do something on cybersecurity. The pipeline situation just highlighted that. So everybody in DC has agreed we need to do something. Now we need to figure out what that's going to be, which it turns out is quite difficult. Just to highlight the situation, there are 5 congressional committees that obviously have jurisdiction over pipeline security. There are a couple other committees that could have jurisdiction over pipeline security. There are 2 entirely different agencies that regulate oil pipelines in this country, the Department of Energy and Department of Homeland Security. But apparently only the Department of Homeland Security has jurisdiction over cybersecurity. So DHS can set the cybersecurity rules for pipelines, but they're going to have to work with the Department of Energy to implement them, all of which means this is actually quite complicated. Bills that have to go through multiple committees these days generally don't do that well just because it takes too long. And that's why there's a bit of a holdup on the cybersecurity legislation, and why to date Congress has only been able to pass fairly basic cybersecurity legislation. Excuse me. You will all recall back in February, President Biden announced a 100-day review of the supply chains for several critical parts of the U.S. economy. Well, the 100 days is up, and we have a result. To absolutely nobody's surprise, all of those reviews concluded that, yes, there are in fact vulnerabilities in our supply chain. Being a little sarcastic there because, as I mentioned back in February and March, there's no way these reviews could legitimately be done from scratch in 100 days. Just not enough time. So the Biden administration always knew this was going to be the result, which is fine. What they're doing is they're establishing the legal foundation of whatever is going to come next. So when they start taking concrete steps to secure our supply chain, should those steps be challenged in court, they will be able to say, we did this 100-day review, the agencies looked at the problem, and this is what they found. So they're creating a paper trail for whatever comes next, which is important and is a good step to take. The administration is now moving to enact new rules and regulations to overcome some of the problems of the supply chain. For example, the president has directed his administration to diversify our supply of rare earth minerals, rather. It's not just metals. A task force has been created to address supply chain disruptions in semiconductors, home building, construction, transportation, agriculture, and food. You'll notice that home building and construction are in there. Home building and construction weren't in the 100-day review that was ordered back in February, but the price of lumber and some other construction supplies have shot up in the last couple months because of supply chain disruptions, so the president threw them in there. Like I said, the 100-day review is not a legal requirement, it just helps. The president is organizing what he's calling a supply chain strike force to look at unfair trade practices. These are things other countries are doing to take production, manufacturing, whatever, of critical technologies in particular out of the United States, and has called for the development of a 10-year plan to release $17 billion to promote battery production and battery recycling. Again, battery recycling isn't necessarily part of the supply chain, but it's a concern and it's something we need to work on. So the president has, at his discretion, $17 billion in accounts approved by Congress, and he's called to use some of that, or all of the $17 billion, he has a lot more than that, to look at battery production. There is an additional year-long review going on of the defense supply chain, public health, information technology, transportation, energy, and food production, except the president's already doing something about food production. Those are all year-long reviews, so we expect their results in February. A little bit of an update on the PRO Act. You will recall the PRO Act, the union organizing bill that includes the ABC test that IEEE-USA is concerned about, is sitting in the Senate, having already passed the House. 47 Democrats have endorsed the bill. 3 have not, Senators Kelly and Sinema from Arizona and Warner from Virginia. Once those 3 sign on as co-sponsors, Senator Schumer has promised a vote. We have had conversations with a number of Senate offices, and we found absolutely no interest in having a dialogue about amending the bill, which I interpreted as those offices deciding the bill was dead. We've heard a couple things in the last week or two that suggest that might not be the case. Senator Kaine, among others, have indicated that the Democrats may try to attach the PRO Act, or at least parts of the PRO Act, to an infrastructure bill, should one move, more on that in a minute, or some other must-pass bill. There was not, as far as I know, an attempt to add it to the Endless Frontier Act. So IEEE-USA continues to be concerned about this bill, and we're continuing to talk to people. I still think it's unlikely that the bill passes, but it appears the Democrats are trying to be creative in finding a way to get it through the Senate. The president has announced a National Artificial Intelligence Initiative, which can be found at www.ai.gov. Good address. This initiative was created by the National AI Initiative Act of 2020, which was passed at the end of 2020. That was part of the NDAA last December. IEEE-USA not only supported that act, but we worked to get it through Congress and actually helped draft parts of it. What the new initiative will do is set up a clearinghouse of information on the government's use of AI. This is designed to do a couple things. One, it's to help the government actually implement AI so that the various pieces of the government can learn from each other, perhaps copy each other, saving time and energy, but also give the public an insight into what the government is doing to help make sure the government gets it right. It creates a task force to coordinate AI projects across the government The thinking there is that the various agencies may want to use AI in more or less the same ways. There's no point in having multiple systems set up. Create one system that works for everybody. It will recommend policy changes to the administration and Congress, and is led directly by the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, which is encouraging. Some interesting state-level anti-technology or tech company legislation that has been moving. And two in particular, one in New York and one in Florida, show kind of the different approaches the two parties are taking to technology, to regulating the tech industry. New York's bill focuses on monopolistic behavior. That is looking at online companies like, say, Google, like, say, Amazon, that dominate their fields that they're working in, and looking to see if those violate antitrust law, perhaps updating antitrust law so it works better in an online environment. The New York bill also requires approval from state regulators for any mergers, tightens the definition of dominance. That is a key antitrust term. The idea is if a company doesn't have to control all of a given market, it just has to dominate the market, which allows it to set prices and set conditions in the market that in a free market wouldn't work. The New York bill has passed the New York State Senate and is pending in the New York House. Now, this is key, important, because, of course, Wall Street is in New York, which gives regulators in New York State far greater authority over things like mergers and antitrust suits than any other state. But you see the focus here is on anti-competitive behavior, basically how companies interact with each other. Florida has taken a somewhat different approach. Florida is focusing on censorship and responding to tech companies' decisions over the last couple of years to kick people off their platforms for expressing particular views, which legislators in some states, particularly red states, have found irritating. The Florida law would create a private and official right of action. That is, if you are kicked off of, say, Facebook, you could sue Facebook to force them to let you back on, or the Attorney General of Florida could bring a case on your behalf. Accounts on social media platforms in particular can only be suspended for 14 days. Oops, bumped my controller there. And political candidates cannot be deplatformed under any circumstances. This being Florida, there is an explicit exemption in the bill for any company, any corporation that maintains a theme park in the state, which of course means Disney, as well as a couple other things. Because, fighting censorship on the internet is very important, but the largest employer in the state, it turns out, is more important. You see the different approach the two parties are taking, though. The Republican, the red Florida state, is looking at censorship and making sure people have access to online systems. New York is looking more at a commercial competitiveness situation in the online world, which is why, despite the fact that both parties have expressed severe irritation with tech companies in the last year or two, nationally, we're not actually anywhere close to legislation doing anything about it. A couple other things in the news. Senate leaders have announced that they have an agreement on an infrastructure bill. I may go into more detail on that next time, but right now there's so many questions and issues and uncertainties that it's probably not worthwhile, but negotiations are moving forward. Dr. Eric Lander has been approved and has now taken his position as the new director of the Office of Science Technology Policy in the White House, making him the country's top science official and the president's top science advisor. Lastly, Representative Lofgren has reintroduced her EAGLE Act. This is the Fairness Act from last year, looking at the green card backlog. The bill removes the country caps from the green card program, which will shorten the wait time for people coming from India, immigrants from India that want to use EB green cards. Unfortunately, it will dramatically increase the wait time for everybody else, except for China and the Philippines, which more or less break even. which is why IEEE-USA isn't terribly excited about the bill. However, Representative Lofgren's bill includes some very useful reforms to the H-1B program. So there is a clear upside to this bill should it pass. Lastly, I want to bring your attention to IEEE-USA's EVO21 Conference, which will be on the 16th, which I guess is just about a week from now. Registration is free and open to the public. They have a fantastic lineup of tech speakers. The conference is targeted at engineering students and young professionals. However, it's open to everyone, and we think that there are speakers that will be of interest to all technology professionals in the United States. EVOconference.org is the website. We encourage all of you to take a look at it and register. It should be a really impressive event. We've done EVO conferences a couple times now, and the past events have been absolutely fantastic. I will also, just to put on your calendar, point out that there will be additional EVO conferences this year on September 1st and November 3rd. All of these conferences will be virtual. Our next update will be June 24th. Please note that that is a Thursday. We're going to have to move these updates from Friday to Thursday. This is related to the fact that the IEEE-USA office will be reopening starting on June 15th. It will be a phased reopening, so not all of the staff will be here, but we should be in the office more regularly. And to accommodate the reopening, I have to shift from Friday to Thursday. I hope that is not too inconvenient to folks. It will still be at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. And before we shift to questions, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat box and I'll rotate them to them in a moment. But I just wanted to remind you that my phone number is 202-530-8326. My email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. If you ever have any questions about things you see in Washington, questions about anything I included in this update or did not include in this update, please feel free to reach out anytime. And with that, let me shift over here. There we go. Okay. Question from Corey Ruth. If the NASA reauthorization from the Senate version of EFA doesn't pass in the House, or the whole bill dies, what does that mean for NASA? Yeah, NASA is kind of like DOD. You'll recall the NDAA last year was a defense reauthorization bill plus a bunch of other things. Technically, if NASA is not reauthorized by January 1st, it shuts down, but that's not going to happen. If the NASA reauthorization in the Endless Frontier Act fails for whatever reason, that part of EFA will simply be tacked on to some other bill later on. I'm not at all concerned that that won't happen. The NASA provisions in the Endless Frontier Act were not especially controversial. There's some interesting stuff in there, which we'll talk about next time. But overall, the senators were pretty comfortable with what the Endless Frontier Act did. So taking that section out and just plopping it into another bill is a fairly simple thing to do. So that's, if Endless Frontier fails, that's exactly what will happen. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions today. Hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Hope life is returning to normal wherever you are. Next time, we will be back with at least part of the IEEE-USA staff here in Washington, D.C. in the office. Thank you all for joining us. I look forward to talking to you again in a couple weeks.